Hello, and thank you for coming to New Techniques for Split-Second DNS Rebinding, where today we're going to look at both how achievable DNS rebinding attacks against web applications can be, as well as some new techniques to achieve fast DNS rebinding against both Safari and Chromium-based browsers. But before we jump into that, hi, I'm Daniel. I work as a researcher at Intruder. We are a SaaS-based vulnerability management platform. I'm mostly interested in scenarios where I don't have source code, and I've got some blogs there, Intruder's blog, where most of my research lives now, personal blog, and website formerly known as Twitter/X up there as well. So today, we're going to start off with a fairly simple bug that led to the inspiration for this project, and specifically my incomplete fix suggestion led to this project. We'll then run through some basics of DNS rebinding and how we can use that to exploit my incomplete fix. And then we'll look at some sort of more advanced techniques, why they kind of fall short at times. And I'll introduce new techniques and tools for attacking both Safari and Chromium-based browsers. So, as I said, this all started with a simpler bug. And it started with a bug in my own company's product. I was doing some security testing, and one of the things that's quite interesting is if a customer adds a target and we see a web server on it, we will show them a screenshot of that web server. Now, through a bit of testing, I noticed that our screenshot workers, which are responsible for taking these screenshots, there's two interesting things about them. The first is that they follow HTTP redirects. So if they try to screenshot acme.org and that redirects to example.com, you'll end up with a screenshot of example.com. And the second thing, which is quite worrying, and is now fixed, of course, is that they can access the EC2 metadata service. Now, for those of you less familiar with AWS, this service is available to all EC2 instances, which are AWS's servers, essentially. And they provide some useful info to the instance, and that can often include AWS credentials or roles available to the instance. So you may already see where this bug is going. Here's what's happened. The attacker starts by adding attacker.com as a target. This is a web server under their control. That target, then our portal sees there's a web server on there, and it tells the screenshot worker, hey, can you get me a screenshot of http://attacker.com? The screenshot worker reaches out to the attacker's web server at attacker.com. That then redirects to the metadata service. So that IP address is always used for the metadata service, and that's the base path of the API. The screenshot worker then loads the metadata service and takes a screenshot of it, sends it back to the portal, and then the attacker can see the screenshot of the metadata service. So through this way, you can basically browse or you could essentially browse the metadata service as though you were the screenshot worker. So that top URL is what I used in that last slide. That sort of confirms access to the service, but doesn't contain anything sensitive in itself. If you go to that middle URL there, you'll see all the roles available to the EC2 instance. And in our case, there was one role available to it. And if you put that role name into that final URL, you'll get temporary credentials out from the AWS metadata service. So obviously heavily redacted, even though they've expired. This is the screenshot that I got out by going through that path. So obviously, I've got all the bigwigs in Slack in a channel, and I suggested some fixes. For the long term, which we've now implemented, I said we need network level restrictions. The screenshotting tools shouldn't be able to access the metadata service or anything else internal. But in the short term, I suggested IMDS v2. So this is version 2 of this metadata service, and it includes some protections to stop attacks like this. Specifically, to request any endpoint on that service, you need to provide a token in a header. And to get that token, you need to make a put request to a specific endpoint on the metadata service with a specific header set. Now, I was working with HTTP redirects here. I can't get them to make put requests. I can't add headers to those redirects. I can't use JavaScript because the same origin policy will block me from just reaching out. So we should all be good, right? This is what I thought. I logged off pretty late at night. Our head of DevOps was hard at work overnight, thinking, hey, everything's fine. And then as I was lying in bed, suddenly I realized I had missed something I've never used before, but DNS rebinding can get around this. So we're going to be focusing on DNS rebinding in browsers, and it's quite important to make sure we all understand the same origin policy. So what I've got up on the screen here is a URL, and I've split it into different parts of the URL. And the three we care about are those first three. So the scheme, the domain, and the port, and together those form the origin. So the origin here, for example, is http app.example.com 8080. And this is a really key thing for browsers. Essentially, any two pages, if they have the same origin, have read-write access to each other in sort of the simplified version. And if I have a page loaded under an origin, I can also request any resource from the server under that same origin. But if app.example.com 8080 wants to try access, say, mail.google.com, the browser will say no because the origin is different. So for DNS rebinding, what we're trying to do, and especially in the scenarios we're looking at today, is to read sensitive data from a target web server. We're just going to look at reading data today, although writing will be very possible with these attacks, or writing to the loader page, that is. And our target web server, we're going to say it has sensitive data at /latest/metadata. So that's the path that matches the AWS metadata service. And there's two requirements for it. So the first is that it needs to serve content over plain HTTP. If HTTPS is in use, this attack won't work. And it also doesn't check the host header. So what this means is if I load up the web server using the domain evil.com, if that resolves the IP of the server, evil.com will end up in the host header. And it's important that the target web server doesn't change its response or block the request because of that. Now, to exploit this, the attacker is going to spin up a web server. It needs to also serve content over plain HTTP and on the same port as the target web server. And it serves the attacker's page to perform the steps of the attack. And we also need a DNS server. So in this case, it's going to be the DNS server for evil.com in my examples. And what this is going to do is the first time you do a lookup of evil.com, it's going to give you the IP address of the attacker's web server on the public internet. And then the next time you do a lookup of evil.com, it will instead return the IP address of our target web server, which is typically on the local network. So let's have a look at what this looks like. Don't worry, we are zooming in. So we've got the target web server on the left, the attacker's web server, and the attacker's DNS server on the right. And the user is loading up http evil.com in their browser. So this triggers a DNS lookup for evil.com. The DNS server says, hey, the IP address is the one of the attacker's web server, so 1.2.3.4. And therefore, the browser then sends the next request to the attacker's web server. This returns the attacker's page, and this page is going to include JavaScript to repeatedly try and request that latest/metadata path. Now, it's not on the attacker's web server, so that's obviously going to fail. And we'll get a 404. After enough time, the browser caches that DNS response for evil.com. But after enough time, that cache entry is going to expire, and the browser is going to have to do another lookup for evil.com. And this time, the attacker's DNS server says that the IP address is the one of the target web server. So the JavaScript's still trying to request that URL, and it ends up reaching out to the target web server. So in this case, it's basically the metadata service, and it gets the response. And importantly, it's requested a page under the same origin as the JavaScript is running, so it can read the response and exfiltrate it out to the attacker's server. So swinging back to me hacking my own company, we also use Zap workers to run Zap scans for customers when we want to scan their web apps. And these run headless Firefox. So rather than a user loading up a page, we now have an automated browser loading up a page, and that's what we're trying to target. And at the time, they could also access the EC2 metadata service. Again, this has been fixed. And so the EC2 metadata service is our target web server here. You might recognize those bullet points from an earlier slide. It meets all the requirements of our target web server, so we can target it with DNS rebinding. And spinning up a DNS server sounded a bit painful. Fortunately, Tavis Ormandy has a rebinder service that you can just go and generate a domain, and it will alternate the IP address it resolves to on successive lookups. So you'll notice that these lookups change. They're probably taken about a minute apart. You'll always be dealing with some sort of intermediate cache. So if you do them one after the other, whatever resolver you're using by default will likely give you the same IP address for about a minute at least. So attacking our portal, this diagram hopefully looks quite familiar. I told the Zap worker to scan my domain. It did a DNS lookup, and it got the IP address of my web server. From my web server, I returned a page to try and repeatedly request /latest/metadata, so that API-based path. Now, I kept the worker busy, so it's trying to spider websites in Firefox, so I just gave it a website with loads of dummy links to keep it clicking around for the maximum time that we allow. So as it was clicking around, its DNS cached response expired. So it has to do another DNS lookup. The Rebinder service helpfully gives it the IP address of the metadata service. So the next request goes to the metadata service here on the left, and we get the response. We can read it in JavaScript. And in theory, we can just send it off back to our web server. We have it in a JavaScript variable. In practice, there was one slight issue. We're doing this all through Zap, and Zap is really aggressive at blocking out-of-scope requests. So sending it back to my web server via IP address will be out of scope, and I can't do that. And remember, the domain now points to the metadata service, so I can't just send it back to that domain. It also blocks the DNS lookups when you try to request something out of scope, so you can't just exfiltrate over DNS. Fortunately, we show a list of scanned URLs to customers, so I can just include the encoded credentials in a URL. And when I look at our scanned URLs, you'll see they show up here. There's a few different stages to get the attack working I've done here, but the important one is that last line, which shows the base64 encoded credentials. And if we decode them, we get the response with AWS credentials that we'd expect from the API. Obviously, again, heavily redacted, sorry. So how bad was this, just briefly? The credentials had extremely limited permissions. Our DevOps team had been through an exercise of locking them down as much as possible already. And I spoke to them about what else you'd be able to reach, what other HTTP services, and it was very limited. And also, we looked at the logs, no exploitation activity, which is great. We deployed IMDS v2 really fast, and the network level restrictions also rolled out very fast, prioritizing that Zap worker. And it was a nice win for defense in depth. Sometimes you dump out AWS credentials from a web app, and it's bad, but I think this kind of highlights the importance of making sure you lock the permissions on those down. So we've been looking at a fairly sort of traditional or simple technique, just waiting for that DNS cache to expire. And this is obviously quite slow. So when I was attacking our portal, it took 10 to 20 minutes for Firefox to do another DNS lookup, or for that DNS lookup to hit the DNS server at least. Now, if you're thinking about just the browser's cache, you can flush it. And what that means is requesting pages on a lot of different domains, so the browser does loads of DNS lookups, fills up its cache, and starts discarding old entries before it otherwise would. With some testing, that will get you down to the order of about 10 seconds before another DNS lookup happens, and therefore your attack can run. But that's if you only have to care about the browser cache. Unfortunately, intermediate caches on resolvers the browser is using are going to be an issue. For example, if you spin up an EC2 instance with Ubuntu, you'll find that it takes about 5 to 10 minutes for a new DNS lookup to be performed, even if you're just doing curl from the command line. And this is because systemd resolve on Ubuntu will run as the default resolver, and it caches entries for a minimum of 5 minutes, whatever the TTL on the response is. And on a VPN that I've used, I've seen a 30-minute minimum cache time. So if you're targeting a web app, you often can't get it to load a page for 5 minutes, and you might not be able to get a user to load a page for that long either if you're trying to target them. So what if, instead of waiting for 2 lookups, we just return both A records in the same response? So let's look at how that goes again. Again, user loads up http://evil.com in their browser. We get a DNS lookup, and we return both our public IP address and the private target web server's IP address. So we're switching to localhost as the private IP address now. So this is a key part. This will only work if the browser happens to reach out to the attacker's web server first. We need it to request our page so that we can get some JavaScript loaded in their browser, and we can repeatedly try to request the file with sensitive information. So we're going to use secret.txt from now on in these examples. Now, when we get that request for the file to our web server, we reset the connection, and the browser knows that it can't really use that IP address anymore. The web server is unreliable. So hopefully, it falls back to the target web server as the only other IP address it knows for that domain. And it gets the secret.txt file. As before, this is all under the same origin, so the JavaScript that sent that request can read the response and send it back out to our server. So in theory, this works great, but that issue of having to load from the public web server first is a bit of a problem, unfortunately. While I was doing testing, I consistently got browsers loading from the private IP address first. And this broke the attack. It's not intended as a security measure, as far as I understand, and one of the Chrome developers even confirmed this for me when I tried to report something I'll show later on to them. But it's really effective at stopping this technique. So we're left with this problem. We need to find a way to get browsers to load from the public IP address first and then trigger them to switch to accessing the private IP address. And how can we force this? Now, with many things, the answer lies if just open up Wireshark and have a look, and you'll get a nice clue here. So what I did, opened up Wireshark, tried to load www.example.com, and you'll see I got two DNS lookups. So we've had the A query that we've been talking about so far, but also there's a quad A query for an IPv6 address rather than IPv4 address. And this provides the key to the techniques I'm going to show you now for attacking both Safari and Chromium-based browsers. So let's start with Safari. As I've said, when you load a website in Safari, you'll send both A and quad A queries for IPv4 and IPv6 addresses. And Safari prioritizes the private address over the public one when it has two addresses to pick from. Now, the interesting behavior in Safari that we can exploit is that it doesn't wait for all DNS responses to come back. As soon as it has one DNS response back, it starts sending requests to try and load the page as fast as possible. So this gives us everything we need to exploit Safari. So we start off, we get the user to load safari.r.intrudes, our domain, in their browser, and this triggers both A and quad A queries for that domain. We respond with only the quad A query, and we don't send the A response yet. So we give it the public IPv6 address of our web server. From there, Safari doesn't care that it's only got one response for two queries. It loads up the page from the web server. As before, that page tries to request the secret file. And at this point, it's going to get no response from our server. It's going to get a 404. And this is when we return the A response. So the next time that the JavaScript tries to request that secret page, Safari has two IP addresses to pick from. It consistently prioritizes the private IP address, which is our target web server. So the request goes to our target web server. We get the response back. It's all under the same origin. We can read it with JavaScript, and we can send it out to our web server. So this is the scary part where I try to demo this to you. Please pray for me. So what we've got here, and you can see it. Text size good? Yeah, nice. So in the top left, we have a tool I've written to basically act as a DNS server and delay responses. There's a few flags there, but importantly, I've told it to give a quad A response of : : 1, so it'll access localhost, an A response of the IPv4 address on my web server, and to delay the quad A response by 300 milliseconds. You might notice this is the other way around the demo I just showed, where I delayed the quad A, or I delayed the A response rather than the quad A. The VPN I'm using has weird behavior, which means it only acts this way around. Off this VPN, I've never seen this anywhere else. It works fine either way. So let's start that DNS server up. We were also going to serve from our web server the small exploit script to do what I discussed. What we've got here at the bottom is a Python server. We're going to generate a random flag into a file and then have it running on localhost over Python. So as you can see, we've got a flag and a file running on localhost now. So hopefully, if I now load up the domain, this is a bookmark for safari.intrudes. It's a domain we run. We instantly get, or not instantly, 300 millisecond delay. We get the private flag from the local web server shown in an alert box. And I'm showing you an alert box here, but you can obviously just post it back off to your web server. Now, 300 milliseconds I've picked to try and keep this reliable on my VPN on this network. In practice, I've found that 100 milliseconds typically works really well and is about the sweet spot for going as fast as possible. But you can obviously just slow it down to keep everything a bit more reliable. So obviously, I'm not leaving you to write your own DNS server. It was painful. If you look at the output code, it will seem very simple. But it took a lot of staring at Wireshark and wondering why my responses weren't accepted. So I've written this for you. It's available on GitHub. I'll make it public after the talk. And all the instructions and everything you need should be in the README, and the exploit code is included in there as well for that little demo that I just showed. Let's continue. We've looked at Safari, so let's look at Chrome. And I'm saying Chrome here, but it actually applies to any Chromium-based browser, including Edge. So, like Safari, Chrome will send A and quad A queries. It prioritizes private over public addresses. And interestingly, it prioritizes IPv6 over IPv4. Now, it cares more about prioritizing IPv6, which means that if we have a public IPv6 address, that will be prioritized over a private IPv4 address. And as soon as it sees the web server reset the connection, it will fall back to any other address it has for the domain. So this gives us enough for a plan. And this plan doesn't work, and I'll tell you why in a second, but we'll improve it and fix it. So we load up our domain in Chrome. We get A and quad A queries. We respond with an A record for our target web server and a quad A record for the attacker's web server on the public internet. Chrome prioritizes the public IPv6 address of the attacker's web server. We return a page which tries to repeatedly request our secret file. And from there, when we receive that request, we reset the connection. So Chrome now knows that it can't really reach out to the attacker's web server reliably, so it's going to try the other IP address it has for this domain, which is the target web server. So it resends that request for the secret file to the target web server, and we get the response back. This was made by JavaScript under the same origin, so in theory, we can just read that response and send it off to our web server. And I thought I'd cracked it. I implemented this and ran it, and I got an error. And it's a weird error. If you look at this, it's telling me from a page under the origin http chrome.r.intrudes, I can't access a file under the same origin because the cross-origin resource sharing policy is in effect, and that's quite confusing. The key is in that second part, which talks about PNA restrictions. These are private network access. This is a specification for trying to segregate public and private networks, and it's partially implemented in Chrome. And it extends cause, which is why we got the cause error in there. So that is still weird and confusing, but it does make some sense. Now, this means that our page loaded from the public internet on the attacker's web server can't make requests to the local network, including our target web server. We try to do it with a fetch request using the JavaScript APIs, and the PNA restrictions are applied to fetch. They're not applied to iframes, though. So we can actually get around this. So we're going to start as before. We load up our page in Chrome. We get A and quad A queries. We give an A response for the target web server, a quad A response for the public IP address of the attacker's web server. The Chrome loads the page, and our page tries to repeatedly request the secret file. Now, from here, that page also has an iframe in it, and we try to set the source of that iframe to that same page that we have loaded, so http chrome.r.intrudes. I've redacted it here for simplicity. We do some checks to make sure that has actually loaded from the local network and not from the attacker's web server. If those checks fail, we just reload the page until it works. And assuming that's happened, we're then going to move on to line 8 here, the inject script function. So before we get to that, though, just to recap and make clear where we are, we've now continued. Because Chrome saw the reset when we set the iframe or URL to this, http chrome.r.intrudes, that got loaded from the target web server on the local network. So we now have our top page here in blue with the origin http chrome.r.intrudes, and that's loaded from the public internet, the attacker's web server. And in that page, we have an iframe under the same origin loaded from the local network. So our top page cannot make requests to the local network because it's from the public internet and it's loaded over HTTP. The iframe can, though, because it was loaded from localhost. And importantly, these are the same origin. So the top page can inject any content into that iframe, including scripts. So let's see what that looks like. We have this inject script function starting on line 1. It gets the document of the iframe, it creates a new script tag, and it puts that script in to the iframe. Now, the content of that script is this inject func, so that it will get called whenever this script's injected into the iframe. And that inject func fetches our secret file, it converts the response to text, and in this case, it just shows it in an alert box. You can just post it back off to your server or exfiltrate it however you want. It's in a JavaScript variable. So to go through what this looks like in full, we now, from where we have that page loaded from the local network in the iframe, we inject script into the iframe. That script requests our secret file, and then we post this back off to our web server. Now, it's demo number 2, so hopefully this doesn't break on me. Rather than just trying to demo finding a file from a local web server, I thought it'd be more fun to attack an actual tool that's fairly commonly used. So we're going to attack GoWitness here. Now, GoWitness is a screenshotting tool. It drives headless Chrome to take screenshots. And I've got it running on an EC2, which has IPv6 access to the internet. So let's start with setting up the attack. In this page on the top left, I have my Rebind server running. So this is a tool that I'll release, and I'll talk about more in a second. It just serves static files until it receives a request to the /block endpoint, at which point it just shuts down. It's a very inelegant way of resetting the connection, but it works. And down below, we have the DNS server running as well. I'm using the DNS delay server again, but I've not got a delay in there. That's just for simplicity of setup. So we've told it to return the IPv6 address of our web server on the public internet, and for A responses, return the IPv4 address of the metadata service. So let's get both those running. One more thing we have is we are posting off data to our web server. So I've just got a little web server here set up to receive that data and decode it from base64 when it's sent off. So this should all be good to go. And now, if I run this command from GoWitness to take a screenshot of my website, hopefully we get some AWS credentials out. And this did work just before the talk, so we'll see how it goes. And I realized I run the wrong command there. There we go. Something always has to go wrong. There we go. So we try to take a screenshot of one of the domains on r.intrudes, which will point to our web server. We get a big response back with loads of base64. But if we look at that, there's actually AWS credentials when they're decoded. So we've grabbed those from the metadata service when GoWitness tried to take a screenshot and posted them off to ourselves. And because I have just shown AWS credentials in front of Black Hat audience, I'm just going to tear that down. Those credentials are locked out as well. You should not be able to do much with them. Now, because my sections have got out of order in a way that I do not understand, please bear with me 1 second while I find the final section. Perfect. So that Rebind server is released on GitHub as well. All the instructions you need will be in the README and everything there. And also there are 2 posts on Intruder's research blog detailing everything I'm talking about today, and those will link to that as well. So just to kind of wrap up now, what are the limitations of this? Well, you have the traditional DNS rebinding limitations. Specifically, the target web server has to ignore the host header. You need to be able to have anything in there, or anything sort of printable in there as an actual domain. And it has to use plain HTTP. HTTPS will break this. And for attacking Chrome and Safari, we also have that requirement that IPv6 access to the internet is required. If you don't have that, the Quad A lookup won't even be performed. So there's not really much scope for other trickery there with trying to return sort of 6-4 responses, for example. Now, if you're driving a headless browser, please ask yourself a couple of questions. Does it need to load arbitrary websites supplied by users? Can you restrict that to HTTPS? The answers to those questions might be yes and no. That's fine. And obviously, bear in mind, if you're trying to restrict what's loaded, pages might redirect, they might embed content. So make sure you're considering everything. But the most important point is that last one. Does the browser need access to internal network services, such as the metadata service or anything else on the private network of the server? The answer is probably no. And if it does, it probably needs very specific access that you can limit. So for example, at Intruder, we keep our tools now in Docker containers on our workers, and we limit the access of those Docker containers. So the EC2 instances themselves can still access the metadata service, but the tools that we run that take user data have really locked down network access. Also, where to next? I have presented a fairly simple look at some DNS, or a fairly simple DNS functionality in here. I haven't sent any weird responses. I haven't used anything particularly exotic in DNS. I think there's probably more areas to explore. Same for private network access. I presented a fairly simple bypass. I think it was about the second thing I tried. I think there's a lot more out there. Currently, it's not fully implemented. It's on the way. The Chrome team are working on it. But I think there's more areas to try and bypass private network access with. And I should say that bypass, I did report to the Chrome team, and they told me it's not a bug and it's fine because they're still implementing. But at some point, if you find a bypass, it will be a bug, and hopefully they'll give you some money. Also, notable omission from this talk, Firefox. It wasn't really my focus. My main concern is actually targeting web apps. And despite us driving headless Firefox, Most web apps are driving headless Chrome, so that's where I put the most effort in. So when a quick look at Firefox didn't find anything, I sort of moved on, but I think there's potentially some behavior in Firefox you can exploit there. Now, if you're going to take away anything from this talk, these are the things I want you to look at. So firstly, DNS rebinding attacks are achievable. I've hopefully shown you that. The attack I presented at the start, I think, is perfectly doable in a time-limited scenario, such as a penetration test. You don't need to sink loads of time into them. You can get them working simply. You also now have some new tools and techniques to help you get them working faster, hopefully, and also very reliably. And also, there are areas of future research. I think there's a lot to come here. So please have a look. There are some references, some further reading there. But finally, with more time than I was expecting for questions, so hopefully you have some, I'd just like to say thank you. Please go look at our research blog. It has everything I've talked about here. I also have a personal research blog, website formerly known as Twitter/X. My company has one. I have one. I tweet about my research and not much else there. And any questions? And then the slides are out of order there, of course. So thank you.